Who is a good guy in history who actually wasn't a good guy? James Marion Sims, the father of modern gynecology, actually committed some pretty nasty human rights violations when he experimented on slave women. He was most well known for operating on vesicovaginal fistulas, and he developed the procedure by practicing it on slave women without anesthesia. When he devised the operation in the early 1830s, he didn't use anesthesia because it wasn't available. However, even after it was a decade later, he still didn't use it. And instead of going out and finding other women who had fistulas, a common problem at the time in women of all races, he would simply find a slave woman he had operated on, tear open her stitches, and re-operate when teaching the procedure to other surgeons. I was reading about him because of this post. First, I'd like to clarify that I am in no way defending what he did. It was and is absolutely wrong, and he was clearly disregarding their humanity and pain. But anesthesia for surgery didn't really become standard until well after he started his experiments. At the time, standard practice was to do the surgery as quickly as possible, then administer opium post-surgery, which is what he did. And the women he experimented on all had severe complications from childbirth, fistulas specifically in most of their cases, that he did successfully fix in most of their cases. He did perform over 30 experiments on one woman alone before he successfully repaired her fistula, which is abhorrent, and I can't even imagine the pain she went through. His negligence did almost kill one of them as well. And his overall racism and disregard for their pain and suffering cannot be excused. He was very much using these enslaved women and girls to hone his technique before he performed this procedure on white women, though they didn't receive anesthesia either. John Batman, founder of Melbourne, also quite active in the Black Line, where hundreds of men and dogs raked the island of Tasmania in a long chain of merciless genocide. His biggest crime, though, he fully intended to name his new settlement Batmania. There are quite a lot of fruit bats in the area. Batmania would have been totally appropriate. But obviously it should have been named Gotham City. I love that the Black Line was a complete and utter failure, only capturing 2 Aboriginals. Coco Chanel was a literal Nazi. Edit. Since folks have been messaging me, she was not only a Nazi spy. After the Germans invaded France, she turned her Jewish business partners into the Nazis to gain control of the company. She helped started several anti-Semitic newspapers as well. Also, she despised gays. That's why I don't buy Chanel. Also, 'cause I'm poor. If it makes you feel better, Chanel is now owned by a Jewish family. Let's also mention Hugo Boss, who actually made Nazi uniforms. The truth is, most large companies in Germany that predate 1945 would have likely served the Nazi regime at some point in some way. Volkswagen, Adidas, and various firearm companies are some that come to mind. Volkswagen didn't just serve the Nazi regime, it was literally founded by the Nazi Party. It's truly astonishing how many corporations willingly participating in the Holocaust are not only still around, but are still industry giants. Fritz Haber was a wonderful contradiction. Pioneered the synthesis of ammonia, which allowed the human population to get as vast as it is now, but also pioneered chemical warfare and oversaw its implementation by the Imperial German Army. The biggest irony is that his family was Jewish, and some of his family was eventually killed in gas chambers with an adaptation of a chemical he created himself. He creates a chemical process to kill people. It gets used for agriculture. He creates a chemical to help with agriculture. It gets used to kill people. The irony goes even deeper. During World War I, he was a huge proponent of the use of chemical weapons in warfare. He was head of the chemistry section in the Ministry of War in Germany, personally leading the teams that developed chlorine gas and others. He defended the use of them and took offense to people deeming them inhumane, claiming projectile weapons were far less humane, as if bullets were nearly as effective at killing en masse as deadly gases. He also remarked that, during peace, scientists belong to the world. During war, scientists belong to their state. He was a hardcore German patriot, even going so far as to convert to Lutheranism, essentially scraping his Jewish identity. Not only did the Nazi regime fully and extensively utilize his research on chemical weapons to create their exceedingly efficient genocide camps, proving the horror of chemical weapons yet again, they used that same patriotism Haber believed he was full of in order to do it. The patriot who loved his nation enough to develop and excuse chemical weapons was betrayed by that nation and had his chemical weapons turned on his own people. It was no doubt a mercy for him that he passed away before World War II. The guilt he would no doubt feel would have been unbearable. Edit. Mistaken on the effectiveness of gas attacks when it comes to killing, but only when it comes to killing. Gas attacks were by far more effective at inflicting casualties in general, especially before countermeasures were developed. Bullet and shrapnel wounds can be treated if they aren't fatal, even in the early 1900s. Chemical burns from gases were, and still are, beyond awful, and not something they could treat easily. Hence, chemical warfare being inhumane, it would be a slow and awful way to die, and living afterwards would be pretty awful too. In my opinion, the real kicker is what happened to his granddaughter Claire after World War II. Her work on a more effective counter against chlorine gas exposure, the very thing Grandpa Fritz personally pioneered the use of in 1915, was mothballed in favor of focusing on nukes. That outright broke her, and she took her own life in 1949. I think Haber is quite interesting. Although he helped develop terrible things, it appears his beliefs were genuine and that he truly wanted to help science and his country. For example, he resigned his post as director of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Physical Chemistry when the Nazis forced him to fire all Jews from the institute. On the other hand, as said, he personally oversaw the release of the mustard gas attack on Ypres, which was so horrible his wife committed suicide at the celebratory party afterwards. I think Haber is quite interesting because he is a double-edged sword. He did a lot of terrible things and a lot of good things, all from genuine beliefs of bettering the world, and it would be a shame to vilify him for his bad actions without looking at the good, or vice versa. That is the reason that the former Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, now part of the Max Planck Institute, still carries his name to this day. His justification for the latter was similar to the mindset behind nukes later on, shortening the war by deploying a frightening new weapon of mass destruction. Obviously didn't work out as expected, but I'd rather put him in a gray area than an evil one. Apparently Gandhi did some pretty sketchy stuff. Had 15-year-old girls sleep in the same bed as him to see if he could control himself. Had his 15-year-old niece sleep in the same bed naked as him, along with other similar-aged relatives, to see if he could control himself. You've added years to that niece's age. Yeah, I thought they were 12 or 13, not 15. Quotation, to see if he could control himself. Dear Diary, I failed to control myself. FML Gandhi. Gandhi didn't believe in equalizing all the classes and races of India, just elevating Indians to the oppressive ruling class that the white British were. Wouldn't let his wife get modern medical attention, made her rely on traditional medicine, like water from the Ganges, saying faith would have to heal her. She died. Don't forget the part where he suddenly became a huge proponent of modern medicine when it was he who was on the deathbed. Sounds like Joseph Smith. According to the Mormon Church website Essays, his child bride was a few months shy of her 15th birthday. Another family's mom died. Joseph volunteered to help take care of the older two teenage daughters and then married them. They reported in their journals they didn't know what to do because their mom was dead and were afraid he would kick them out of their home. He told them that an angel with a drawn sword appeared to him and threatened him if he didn't marry these teenagers. He had 39 wives, including multiple teenagers and several married women. Charles Lindbergh was a rabid anti-Semite, pro-Nazi, and adulterer. He hid an entire other family in Germany, including two sisters he had children each with. My grandfather flew with Lindbergh. He hated the man. Nothing but bad things to say about him. On the topic of aviators being dongs, I used to work with a guy who packed Chuck Yeager's parachutes during his breaking the sound barrier era. The dude was allegedly a massive butthole to literally everyone who wasn't a test pilot and went out of his way to belittle them. The guy who packs my parachutes is probably the last guy I'd want to be a dong to. Oprah Winfrey has given a platform to some pretty awful people, like Dr. Phil, Dr. Oz, and the prolific rapist John of God, and her early days were basically Jerry Springer-type crap. The Oprah interview of Nathan Lane and Robin Williams from years ago popped up on Reddit a few days ago, where she basically tried to out Nathan Lane and Robin Williams being the absolute class act that he was, basically jumped in between them and started doing his shticks to take the attention off of Lane. Today I learned Nathan Lane wasn't out yet when he filmed Birdcage. He didn't come out until 1999. This needs to be higher. Oprah is not the saint people make her out to be, and has put a lot of dangerous people and ideas into the spotlight while taking zero responsibility for the damage done. Adolf Hitler, big animal rights activist in the 1930s and a vegetarian during a time it wasn't socially acceptable. This is a really crazy thing for me, to be honest. It would be easier for me to accept the existence of Hitler if he was just, like, cartoonishly evil in every aspect of his personality, but he wasn't. He had some extremely progressive and forward-thinking ideas about animal rights, vegetarianism, the rights of working people, etc. And he also wanted to massacre all of the Jews and enslave the rest of the world. It's difficult for me to reconcile how those two viewpoints can coexist in one mind, because it's proof positive that literally anyone can be a monster. It doesn't matter how nice they are to you, how much they say the right things, whatever. You don't know what they believe in their heart of hearts or what they would do if they had the power to make it happen. I think this is pretty normal in the context of human history, and present times as well. No one is pure good or pure evil, that's just the work of propaganda for idealization. Also, some people are considered heroes in one culture and villains in other cultures. I think the problem is that for figures like Hitler we remove their humanity, and generally do treat him and others as cartoonishly evil. The sad reality is that Hitler was just as human as the rest of us, and was capable of all the same emotions we have. Love, hate, compassion, fear, pride, etc. Any one of us could become just as evil as him in the right context, and I think that scares a lot of people, so it's easier to depersonify him. Many people before Hitler were just as or even more cruel. They just didn't have access to the same industrial capacity that he did. My 12th grade civics teacher once said, "If they're in your history textbook, they're a butthole." Dang, just when you think know who Rosa Parks really was. Sir John A. Macdonald, first Prime Minister of Canada, father of Confederation, and completely decided that Indigenous people had no place in it and were disposable. In 1885 he even put a vote to the House of Commons to take the vote away from people of Chinese origin on the grounds they were a different race than Europeans. On another note, we learned in history class that suffragettes fought for the right for women to vote. In reality they fought for the right for white women to vote. Various racial minorities didn't get the right until decades later. Stauffenberg, one of the guys who attempted to kill Hitler. Many see him as a hero. But he was just a Nazi like all the others. He just didn't like the way Hitler was progressing with his regime. He still supported the NS agenda. Oliver Cromwell to everyone except Southern English people, it seems. John Wayne. He was drunk every day most of his life, so racist even racists thought he was racist, a complete butthole to the point where his idol hated him, a story thief who would take stories of others but make it his own, Carlos Mencia style, and helped perpetuate wars while actively avoiding ever being in them. He was apparently an okay dad according to his kids, I think, but beyond that he was a sea of epic proportions. Also, he would routinely punch women. His second wife was a teenager that he allegedly trafficked into the US from Mexico. He also apparently had to be held back when Sacheen Littlefeather was at the Oscars. If anyone isn't aware, she was there on behalf of Marlon Brando to decline his Best Actor win in protest of how natives were treated by the film industry. People were booing her and Clint Eastwood even made a jab at her when she got off the stage. He dodged the draft and make macho war movies to compensate. Henry Fonda was a great example of someone who was an outward great person, but an absolutely terrible person to his family. He was by virtually all accounts, including his own, an absolutely terrible, cold, and cruel husband and father. Some people still think Andrew Jackson was a good U.S. president, despite the fact that he was responsible for the Trail of Tears. Erwin Schrödinger was a genius with a taste for girls as young as 12. He groomed a girl when she was 14, and when she was 17 he got her pregnant. He was 39. She had an abortion that left her sterile. Steve Jobs, his authorized biography, was pretty brutally honest about what a butthole he was and all the crappy things he did. Yeah, and I don't believe he actually said all the brilliant quotes he's been attributed to. He's the first big cult of personality of the 21st century. Edison stole other people's ideas, didn't create them, but took credit. Freud, the man was a monster, and wrong about most things. I still see him quoted in healthcare and academia. King Leopold II, he was a known philanthropist and humanitarian at the time, so when news that he was conducting one of the largest genocides in history broke out of the Congo, many didn't believe it at first. Heart of Darkness was written about this tragedy. Einstein was an absolute jerk to his wife. Perseus in Greek mythology is revered for being a son of Zeus and killing the Gorgon, Medusa. Medusa was a mortal woman who was raped by Poseidon in the temple of Athena. Athena was so pissed at this, that she turned Medusa into a Gorgon, snake hair, hideous face, turns anyone she looks at into stone. Perseus, Poseidon, and Athena are all remembered in history for their righteousness, bravery, strength, etc. Fuck that bullshit. Medusa deserved to kill them all, not be raped, villainized, and killed herself. James Watson, one of the Nobelists with his partner Francis Crick for the discovery of DNA. The guy was, still is, a terrible racist who believes that black people are inferior intellectually. He did not acknowledge the groundbreaking work of Rosalind Franklin, who did much of the work Watson took credit for. He believed that women were also inferior to men. Guy sold his Nobel medal to fund his other pet projects. He is, despite the award, an international pariah. And my poor girl Rosalind died early in life from said work. I had the chance to meet Watson a few years ago while I was in school. Incredibly classist, and still managed to insult Rosalind Franklin all this time later. Thomas Jefferson. It wasn't that he was all that much worse than others. He was no Hitler, okay? But he was very much a man tied to his base instincts when it came to women, girls. His love slave was pretty young when he selected her. He never did get around to freeing her, and had to be convinced to free his children with her on his death. When he got into debt, he paid them off by selling 200, out of the 600 he owned, slaves, downriver. Which, if you know anything about what that phrase means, it will send chills down your spine. Alexander Graham Bell was horrible to the deaf. He wrote articles about why they shouldn't get married and tried to force them to learn how to speak. He went against signing and was terrible to those who did sign. Thanks for listening.